On one of these occasions, I might just submit to my urge to misbehave and open the proceedings with a really radical intervention. Turn a cartwheel or moon dance across the stage. Stuart always loved a show. Until then, I'm going to thank you all for attending this special event, the 6th annual public conversation of the Stuart Hall Foundation. For those who are not regulars at our Conway Hall events, I'm Becky Hall, a trustee of the Stuart Hall Foundation, and as Stuart and Catherine's mostly very well-behaved daughter, often tasked with the job of introductions. In fact, an imagined forthcoming anthology talking about my parents, why I became a shrink, and other matters, is a side hustle project that I'm increasingly convinced has legs. The opening chapter might indeed be called The Urge to Misbehave, a Detour, and may yet be the much-needed supplement to my NHS pension I've been looking for. The Stuart Hall Foundation was established in 2015 by family members, friends, and close colleagues in much the same way as I imagine many of the important collectives in and around Stuart's life to have taken shape. That's to say, in somebody's front room. Having grown up once upon a time in smoky living rooms bursting with cultural studies corduroy, disillusioned communists and democratically collectivized gangs of children, the 1970s, sat on sofas entirely reupholstered by the presence of formidable flocks of fabulous feminists, the 80s, mooching around a kitchen radically reimagined by the groovy black British art scene, magnificently draped around the table, the 1990s, it should have been no surprise that after several robust rounds of tea and a stiff coffee cake, no one smoked by 2015, a new collective came into being. In these last 7 years, with the addition of new friends and supporters, the Stuart Hall Foundation has committed itself to public education, addressing urgent questions of race and inequality in culture and society through talks and events, and the development of a lively network of Stuart Hall Foundation scholars and artists in residence, many of whom are with us today. At our annual Scholars Workshop yesterday, we heard live poetry, a surprisingly uplifting disquisition on pessimism, ethical questions of fieldwork with historically oppressed groups and literary archaeology, the problematics of colonial photographic archives, NHS work with complex children in hospital settings, the exodus of Haitians from Bolsonaro's Brazil, and the disturbing issue of the growing police presence in British schools. Our public conversation event always takes place at this time of year, settling somewhere alongside Stuart's birthday on the 3rd of February and the anniversary of his death, which was yesterday. It has been our yearly moment to take stock, come together in person with a public audience, and an invitation to engage with the work of writers, artists, poets, journalists, musicians, academics, dancers and activists, offering responses to recent political, cultural and social situations here in Britain and in the wider world. As the next step in this developing tradition, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Jacqueline Rose, internationally recognized for her writing on feminism, literature and psychoanalysis, South Africa and Israel-Palestine. Co-director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Humanities, fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Literary Society, Jacqueline is a renowned author with many years of teaching experience and a regular contributor to the LRB. Her new book, cheerfully titled The Plague, Living Death in Our Times, is due for publication in the United Kingdom next spring. Jacqueline knew Stuart for many years, and towards the end of his life, when he was less mobile, was a frequent visitor, reader, conversationalist, and good friend. It was after one of these visits, during one of our daily phone calls, that Stuart, always rather freewheeling and unusually optimistic in his approach to time, until sternly chaperoned back into the right decade by my mother, said that we really should find more space to talk about British object relations. Indeed we should, I said. You could learn a thing or two from Melanie Klein. When can you fit me in? In the end, there wasn't time, but I think of the paper we're going to hear as a link to this new spark of interest, so late in the day that Jacqueline's visit had brought alive. We're very glad to have her with us. Jacqueline's keynote paper, What is the Subject? Politics and Psyche After Stuart Hall, will be followed by a short break, after which she'll be joined in conversation with Dr. Sharon Numa. Sharon originally trained as a clinical psychologist and worked in the NHS before training as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist with adults at the Tavistock Clinic, and then as a psychoanalyst at the Institute of Psychoanalysis, where she is now a fellow. She works in private practice, teaches, supervises, and recently edited an important book on the early building blocks of identity. It's a great pleasure to welcome Sharon and to thank her in person for finally submitting to my wily email campaign to get her to join us. Jacqueline and Sharon will be in a kind of conversation for about 25 minutes, after which we'll invite questions from you, the audience, and hope very much you'll take up the offer to participate in the conversation. Things will be drawn to a close with an extract from Trevor Mattheson's film, The Conversation Continues, We Are Still Listening, which was originally commissioned in June last year as part of our collaboration with Highgate Cemetery, where Stuart is buried. We hope very much that you enjoy this event as much as we've enjoyed working with all those involved to bring it together. And without further delay or a cartwheel, I'd like to invite Jacqueline up to the stage to present her keynote. Sorry, can you just turn your phones off as well, please? That was my one housekeeping bit. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for coming. Let me just start by saying I've heard Becky Hall speak many times, and I've always thought, I'm so glad I'm never going to have to follow that act. So this is a first in many ways. I want to start by saying what an honor and privilege I feel it is to be here and to be giving this talk. Thinking about it, I thought I can't think of anybody whose presence is so missed and whose voice is nonetheless still so present, so heard, and so needed as Stuart Hall. So I want to thank the Stuart Hall Foundation for inviting me to give this talk, Catherine Hall, Becky Hall, and the trustees of the foundation, and also the fellows of the foundation. Thank you for welcoming me yesterday to your workshop at the end of the day. I also want to thank Orsod Malik and Harriet Fleuro, who have been absolutely, without reservation and with immense patience, have put this event together, and I'm very appreciative of all the work that's been done behind the scenes by other people whose names I don't have. And then finally, I would very much like to thank Sharon Numa, who will be responding in conversation with me later in the program. And by the way, you won't hear about Melanie Klein from me, but I'm assuming you will from her. So that, I hope, will be a productive and interesting dialogue, not least of all for me, as well as for all of you. So thank you again. And let me start with a moment from Familiar Stranger, the memoir of Stuart Hall's life, written in conversation with Bill Schwartz, which appeared in 2017, 3 years after he died. It occurs on a London street in 1951, shortly after Hall leaves Jamaica for Britain to take up his place as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, which, as you know, is one of the foremost elite institutions of education in the UK. And as he passes Paddington Station, he sees a stream of black people pouring out into the London afternoon. Too poorly dressed to be tourists, who were they, he asks, and what were they doing here? It turns out that they were the advance guard of what will become the Black Caribbean post-war, post-Windrush generation migration that will transform the face of Britain. But the young black student feels no affiliation with these migrants who have arrived in the UK from a part of the world which he thought he had left behind, which he both sees and can no longer see, and in fact, in a sense, has never seen as his home. You will all be familiar with the Windrush story, which through the investigative journalism of writers like Amelia Gentleman has garnered new attention over the past years as just one, albeit the most extreme or an extreme example of the racist cruelty of the British state towards migrants welcomed to these shores for only as long as their labour was required. More than 50 years later, many of them became the targets of enforced deportation, regardless of whether they had been born in the UK or had arrived there as a very young child. And the story is, of course, not over. In early January this year, it was reported that Suella Braverman is about to abandon 28 of the 30 recommendations made by the formal Windrush inquiry set up with the government after the story broke. For example, the recommendation to increase the powers of the Independent Chief Inspector on Borders and Migration, or to create the post of Migrant Commissioner who would speak up for migrants. Now, what this means is that independent scrutiny of the government's dehumanizing migration policy and laws, insofar as it ever existed, will effectively be shut down. Migrants will have no voice, without which their ongoing claims for historical remembrance, for redress and compensation are bound once more to fail. Now, for Stuart Hall, that 1951 moment on Paddington Station was revelatory. Quote, "For them and for me, a fateful moment of transition frozen in time. What I had thought I had left behind as an unresolved dilemma had turned up to meet me on the other side of the Atlantic." He had anticipated all sorts of new beginnings, but had never imagined that London would secrete this explosive little time bomb from the past. In fact, he'd arrived in the UK barely 2 months before. He could see his world, quote, "turning inside out as if the real Caribbean, which at home had remained beyond my reach, had come to meet me, of all places, in England." So what is the subject? Unmistakably in this instance, to be haunted. Transgenerationally, to use the term that will be theorized by Hungarian psychoanalysts Nicholas Abraham and Maria Torok, emigres to Paris in the late 30s and early 40s respectively, in flight from another violent history whose effects are still felt to this day. Transgenerational haunting describes how unspoken histories, personal and political, secrete themselves without our knowledge deep inside the mind. Something is encrypted in the unconscious down through the generations. First inside a family, an individual family, when the next generation find themselves enacting its secrets and lies, and then collectively as the term has rolled across the public horizon, accumulating other political histories on its path. For example, the genocide of the Jews, which kept recurring in the stories of the patients who Abraham and Torok found themselves treating in Paris after the war. South Africa, in its failed struggle to lay the ghosts of apartheid to rest, and we might add, courtesy of Stuart Hall, Jamaica, whose denial of its slave-dependent past, the family of Hall's mother had originally been slave owners, its colonization by Britain, and its continuing investment in the forms of racial inequality and depression, endemic to both, slowly enters the psychic consciousness of the young Stuart Hall. "I sometimes wonder," he writes, "if inside my family life this displaced larger history was in some way being restaged in its own theatre with its own disturbing psychic properties. Though buried and repressed," he elaborates in his 1982 essay, The Empire Strikes Back, "though buried and repressed, the traces of such a history infect and stain many strands of thinking and action, often from below the threshold of conscious awareness. Almost imperceptibly, we have moved into the unconscious, where what cannot be spoken leaks into the inner world and spreads like an infection or a stain." Without necessarily realizing what was happening, Hall had already set himself a lifelong task. Quote, These childhood experiences represented for me a slow disentangling of threads, a process of disenchantment and disaffiliation, pointing towards a radically different path ahead, an unpleasant experience replete with gaps, contradictions, evasive silences, guilt, and rage. He is describing a threefold trauma: the founding violence of slavery and colonialism, the subsequent denial, the enraged, guilty, anguished process of memory itself. Post-mortem terror, an expression Hall takes from Richard Wright, writing in the aftermath of Ghanaian independence, can do cover for all three. Now, the familial silence on Jamaican history, above all his mother's accommodation with the drastic forms of racial inequalities, which were, and in many ways still are today, its ongoing legacy, plays a key role in his decision to leave. And the personal stakes could not be higher. He says he would not have survived if he had stayed. At one point, when he's packing his bags for the journey on which she will accompany him, his mother condones a British newspaper article arguing that blacks should be expelled from the UK. We are not told how she reacts when he points out that by moving to England, which for her represents a major social and racial ascent, he is about to become such an unwelcome black himself. Although he himself is not strictly a migrant, every Jamaican, he writes, is the product of a migration, forced or free. It is then hardly surprising that the outpouring of impoverished migrants onto the Bayswater streets should strike him with all the force of the return of the repressed, this explosive little time bomb from the past. Now, as I started to read and reread Stuart Hall's writing for this lecture, I realized I had been utterly unprepared for how quickly and fully the vocabulary of psychoanalysis, amnesia, disavowal, recognition, misrecognition, fantasy starts to saturate the scene of politics. Before we know where we are, certainly before he knows where or who he is, the building blocks of an incipient psychoanalytic project are in place. We are talking about a radical disorientation of the subject whose unraveling, not solution, whose unraveling will become the core of his intellectual, political, and inner life's work. I'm going to read you some lines which read for me very much like a psychoanalytic manifesto. My argument turns on what can and cannot be imagined, and on where the past enters consciousness such that it can further inform the historical present and become worldly. In other words, it's to create a collective mentality which, far from being paralyzed by the disavowals of the past, would allow new generations to engage strategically with the past, to become a properly historical force, and to reach out to our world. Now, I'm sure I'm not alone in hearing in these remarks a commitment to something of a psychoanalytic project, or one version of psychoanalysis as expressed in Freud's famous dictum, Wo es war, soll ich werden. A project which in this case seems to me to hover somewhere between the standard James Strachey translation, where id was, their ego shall be, which puts the unconscious at the mercy of rational control, and the more scandalous version of the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. There where it was, so shall I come to be, which requires the ego to discard any illusions of ascendancy and self-completion, and as the always disoriented subject of its own histories, enter the fray of the unconscious and the drives. Note, too, how the aim is to create a worldly subject attuned to past injustice, something which surely should resonate with analysts seeking today to decolonize their practice, to redress the silence on race and the legacies of colonial violence, which until very recently has mostly prevailed in the consulting room. So we're doubly lucky to have Sharon Numa with us this evening because she has been at the core of this project in the UK, the decolonizing of psychoanalysis. Now, for Hall, this is a political task which involves immersing himself into the darkest core of the human mind. I have never believed in snatching some simple good alternative out of the mess, he writes. I think we are always working on the mess. This was his Pavis lecture on multiculturalism in 2000. Only if you confront the mess of things, delve beneath the surface, let in the silenced voices of history clamoring at the gate, is there the slightest prospect of understanding, let alone transforming the nightmares of our contemporary world. Hall is not idealizing the unconscious. He ends his 1987 essay on psychoanalysis and cultural studies with reference to the violence and aggression which psychoanalysis recognizes in us all. One thing is clear: negotiating this inner space is interminable. Hall is holding out no prospect of an identity which will finally be at peace with itself. I cannot become identical with myself, he wrote in his 2007 essay, Through the Prism of Intellectual Life, words that Bill Schwartz chose as one of the epigraphs for the memoir. And the other was Madame Merle's famous question in Henry James' The Portrait of a Lady: what do you call oneself? Where does it begin? Where does it end? And James was one of the writers who had the strongest influence on Stuart Hall. Identities that flounder are the bearers of psychic truth. They bear witness both to the infinite complexity of psychic life and to our deepest implication in the ills of the world through which we must continue to struggle. I think it is this founding history and its afterlife that allows Stuart Hall to be so wired into aspects of British politics that fall outside the remit of the traditional left. He himself traced his own emerging political awareness to Suez and to the Soviet occupation of Hungary, both in 1956, which laid bare the ills of empire simultaneously on its two antagonistic military invasive flanks. An early essay on Anthony Eden following the Suez debacle already hints, he suggests, at his attunement, quote, to the dysfunctions and displacements of political life, which would lead to his startling and hugely influential analysis of Thatcherism as a form of collective insanity and/or a world in hoc to the logic of the dream. That's his expression, Thatcher, the logic of the dream. Thatcherism, a term he coined, would only submit to an analysis willing to broach the innermost psychic components of political identity. How did such a damaging political ideology and program manage to exploit so deftly the hidden desires and fears, quote, the diffuse and often unorganized social fears and anxieties of the British people? How could Thatcherism lead vast swathes of the public, including the working class, to vote for policies so manifestly against their own social and economic self-interests? The Conservatives gained 43.9% of the popular vote when Thatcher was first elected, a percentage, by the way, never seen before and never since, despite the dismaying last run of Conservative victories that we have witnessed over the last 10, 11, 12 years, unmatched since. Now, though Hall does not go so far as to call on Freud's concept of the death drive, he was, I think, offering an analysis of political self-destruction in no uncertain terms. For many on the left, he would never be forgiven for dispensing, once and for all, one might argue, with a form of Marxism which pinned its hope on the revolutionary consciousness of the working class and with the concept of economic self-determination or class self-determination, determination which upheld it. His suggestion at the end of the 1950s that class could no longer be relied on to secure party political affiliation was met with outrage. In a 1959 piece entitled The Big Swipe, which he wrote as an Oxford scholar for Universities and Left Review, precursor of New Left Review, of which he became the first editor, he politely, or impolitely, suggested that if his most vocal critic, quote, got out on the knocker instead of onto the shop floor and said to the first head which came round the corner, vote Labour, he would see what I mean. The problem, writes Michael Rustin in his afterword to Stuart Hall's selected political writings, the problem was to retain the essential idea of capital's pervasive power within the entire social system, yet also to recognize the essential role played by subjective meaning and political agency. And Hall commented, because ideas do not spring out of thin air, the left tends to believe that they do not matter. Giving them their due means taking into account way beyond the concept of relative autonomy, the force of subjective factors in any lived political moment, and then allowing to that sphere its own unconscious dynamic. The mind is its own place. The mind has a mind of its own. This is a domain which, without even ever having to name it, the right has always been most talented at knowing how to manipulate. Now, if Margaret Thatcher tilled this terrain to perfection, the ground had been well prepared throughout the 1970s by a creeping conservative authoritarianism wedded to the state apparatus of constraint, which Hall described as a steady move, quotes, towards a kind of closure in the apparatus of state control and repression. Now, this is something which the legal clampdown on protest and on strike action is, of course, repeating, indeed exceeding today. Protests to be banned before they've even taken place, strikers, this is really the most shocking, I think, who refuse to supply a government-imposed minimal service in areas of the economy deemed essential will face the sack. Under Thatcher, social market values became untouchable. Competition, the so-called overtaxed individual, welfare coddling, handouts by the state, each one aimed at setting the contours of an autonomous, self-centered political subject in stone, a subject who takes care of themselves and are proud of the fact at the cost of pretty much everybody else. As Marx himself had written with reference to those governed by property, commodities, and exchange, quote, the only force that brings them together and puts them into relation with each other is the selfishness, the gain, and the private interests of each. And Stuart Hall quotes those lines. Nation, family, duty, authority, standards, self-reliance are the ever-recurring mantra of this deal. A heady mix of authoritarian populism, a term coined by Hall to indicate a process irreducible to state power, a heady mix of authoritarian populism coupled with an idealization of capital sabotages the post-war social democratic consensus. As the project struggles on long after Thatcher's demise, Hall marvels at its enduring ability to couple virulent free marketism, quote, with a massive dose of social revanchism, masquerading under the umbrella of Little Englandism and the family. Since the 1950s, he says, a profound historical forgetfulness had overtaken the British people. Only a militant nationalism which projects its own past violence onto hatred for the indigenous and migrant non-white population could entrench itself with such unremitting force. Imperial decline, coupled with recession, gave racism its cue. People had been scared over to conservatism. The great syntax, his phrase, of good versus evil, civilized, uncivilized, anarchy and disorder divides up the world into its appointed stations. Hall is pinpointing the unconscious grammar of state-sanctioned violence against the excluded other, where to be white is to belong to a, quote, particular, unique, and uninterrupted progressive history, an advanced civilization crowned by a worldwide imperium. It is surely no coincidence that these thoughts about imperial greatness, whose fantasy, of course, lingers on long after the project has in fact died, arise when he returns for the third time in Familiar Stranger to reflect on that founding Bayswater, Paddington Station scene. Those Caribbean migrants had no idea what they were letting themselves in for. To say that Hall's interpretation was unorthodox on the left is therefore an understatement. Above all, I would suggest for the way he insists on uploading and scrutinizing the most frightening unconscious components of political power. What drives nations crazy, his word, is the dissolution of past glories. Chauvinism in its Little England form is, quote, irrational, largely unconscious, defensive, and abreactive, all terms taken from his 1995 essay, Parties on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown. At the time he was writing, the Brexit referendum was still, of course, a pipe dream of the far right, but this did not stop Europe from becoming, in his words, quote, the fetish the display signifier, the repository into which all these dark and unrequited elements of the British psyche, listen to the vocabulary again, all these dark and unrequited elements of the British psyche have been decanted, the hatred of all foreigners, not just black or brown. Only the Conservative Party knows that this heady ensemble, as he puts it, this mix, is the one, quotes, popular current of feeling in the country into which a disaggregated party of the right can tap. And I think it sounds as if he's talking about now. In fact, today, the far right is even more vocal than before. It has also chalked up a chilling set of electoral victories, as you will all know, across the globe, from Hungary to Turkey to India, from Italy to Sweden, and more. Hall could have been talking about the world of Jair Bolsonaro and Donald Trump, whose removal from office in no way signals the collapse of the political reality they crafted out of hatred, nor of their political ambitions. Thatcher's genius was to personify and secure the linkage, quote, between an inchoate surge of feeling in the country and the main thrust of government policy and the state. We are talking about a massive and obscene co-opting of unconscious forces in the name of state power, what Chomsky famously described as the manufacture of consent. Obscene, by the way, is again Stuart Hall's word, this time for what the Tories had done to the NHS. So we can only imagine what word he would have used for what they're doing to the NHS today. For many, amongst whom I include myself, the radical potential of psychoanalysis is rooted in its critique and disruption of what passes for the norm. Under Thatcherism, indeed this is the very kernel of the analysis, the forces tapped by psychoanalysis are instead conscripted into the norm's service. And I think the originality and boldness of this analysis truly cannot be overstated. It was one of Stuart Hall's unique gifts to offer analysis of the moment as it unfolded before our very eyes. Conjunctural analysis, to use Antonio Gramsci's term. Gramsci was the major influence and the subject of a substantial essay that he wrote in 1986. I'm sure I'm not the only person who finds Stuart Hall's talks exhilarating in ways I could never understand fully, given that the news he was conveying was pretty much uniformly dire. Hall offered his readings as interpretation and self-commentary, tracing his own intellectual path. It is the task of theory to keep track of political life and of itself. Psychoanalysis was, as he saw it, an interruption in cultural studies insofar as it foregrounds the question of the unconscious, something about which in its first stages cultural studies had absolutely nothing to say, any more than it did on the issue of sexuality and gender at the heart of feminism. Indeed, as he writes in his 1987 paper on psychoanalysis and cultural studies, quote, it walked and talked and looked at and attempted to analyze a culture, a human society, as if it had no sexuality, as if the subjects of culture were unsexed. But since he's one of the founders of cultural studies, I think it must be fair to say that the person here he's criticizing is at least also himself. Sociological accounts of human motivation and behaviors, on the other hand, left no room for the processes of introjection and projection through which all identities are at once internally secured and loosened, fastened, and undercut themselves. For Hall, the question of subject identity is foundational to our understanding of agency and politics. But without the idea of a disruptive unconscious, we have no way accounting for the fact that identities exceed their own remit, rather than hardening inevitably and irreversibly into place. Now, for Lacanian psychoanalysis, another key reference point, there can be no final settlement between inner processes and the demands of the outside world. If subjectivity is divided or split, neither our knowledge of ourselves nor the identities enjoined on us by that world can ever be finalized. At one point, Hall even refers to those foreclosures we define as identities, tipping the whole process into the domain of psychosis. We should never underestimate the damage that holding fast to such identities can cause, especially at the merest hint that they might be fraudulent or frail or fail, or indeed all three. Our nightly dreams are there to remind us that no human subject arrives at their destination, that there is no psychosexuality which is ever complete. And for this reason, by the way, the concept of subject position has always struck me as a contradiction in terms, because to be a subject means that you're always mobile and that no position ever secures itself. Crises only arise when a number of contradictory determinants come together and, quote, fuse in a ruptural unity, of an expression he takes from Althusser, which means that they are also liable to fall apart. He was writing about the banking crisis that started in 2007. There are no singular pathways any more than there are predictable outcomes to history. Now, Gramsci also defined the human personality as strangely composite. For Gramsci, there was, Hall comments, no pre-given unified ideological subject, but rather a plurality of selves and identities out of which the so-called subject of thought and ideas is composed. Composite, plural. These are terms to warn the left once again that political identities are unlikely to be consistent. The proletariat do not always have revolutionary thoughts any more than black anti-racist consciousness can be guaranteed. The impact on the very conception of politics itself, he writes, was nothing short of electrifying, as was already clear in those earlier responses to Hall's departure from a more orthodox Marxism. Gramsci is talking about a grammar of politics. Something in the mood music has to shift. And this is a quote, he's summing up Gramsci: the substitution of the conditional tense for positive certainty is critical. Identities are sliding, he writes in Fantasy Identity Politics of 1989. You have to come to a full stop, not because you've uttered your last word, but because you need to start a new sentence, which may take back everything you just said. Once you have acknowledged that misfit between the different fragments of human identities, between outer and inner worlds, the field of cultural studies, he says, will be totally different from what it was before. The concept of overdetermination, also imported via Althusser, means that so-called identities we carry are home to multitudes. There is no single determinant, not economic, not of class, not of gender or race. No way of establishing once and for all who we want to be or who we think we are. Only politics, Gramsci wrote, creates the possibility for maneuver and movement. Now, Hall, I think we could say, I certainly felt by the time I've been reading this material and thinking about it, is trying to let as much air and movement into our political and psychic lives as is humanly possible, which might also do as his definition of culture in and of itself. By the time he has finished, I don't think it's going too far to say that the idea of any single or straightforward determination of our conduct as political subjects no longer has a leg to stand on. It then falls with renewed urgency to culture itself to make that reality the impetus of change and a cause for celebration. Rivington Place, which opened officially in 2007, his brainchild for which he secured the funding and which he championed from the outset, would be a brilliant example, a unique showcase for black artists and the first gallery space in the UK dedicated to culturally diverse art. Hall's critique of the left in the name of more mobile forms of identification was his bid for freedom. If every component of our social and political being hung unfailingly together, there would be no room for maneuver. There would be no point. His commitment to cultural activity belongs, therefore, at the very core of his politics. While I have not come across any reference to Winnicott in his writing, I think he shares with him, D.W. Winnicott, the child pediatrician and psychoanalyst, I think he shares with him a vision of culture as a transitional space with a ludic potential to thwart innermost rigidity and dogma. For Hall, psychoanalysis therefore offers a vision of the human psyche as entrapped by its own histories, and also as the site of a creativity which challenges the mind's worst intentions for itself. As I went on reading, I started to have a strange feeling that far from occupying the position of the analyst, a role which theory is often in danger of assigning itself, cultural studies itself, in Stuart Hall's version, was starting to function as the unconscious or hidden truth of Thatcherism, and not only Thatcherism, whose mainstay was the conviction that identity, or rather identity in its socially requisite forms, was available for humans to possess, a little bit like council houses. The reactionary discourse on the family and sexual normativity surely follows. Quote, "The idea that at the end of the 20th century, after the revolution in the position of women and in sexual attitudes we have passed through," he wrote in part, "is on the verge of a nervous breakdown, it would be possible to advance the modernization of British society by an ideological commitment to the monogamous nuclear family as the only credible and stable family form, gives modernity such a deeply conservative inflection that it hardly deserves the name." End of quote. It was a backlash, one that is being revived today and which explicitly targets the university study of humanities and cultural studies, this time with a ferocious determination, which I, for one, have not witnessed before, as if the real target of the so-called culture wars is in fact culture itself. I always like to think that Stuart Hall and I were inching towards a conversation which indeed we began, and which for me will never end, and writing this lecture has been the next stage. It was, I discovered, not just psychoanalysis, but psychoanalysis in an unprecedented dialogue with feminism, which represented for him that interruption of cultural studies as it had hitherto been understood. On this, Juliet Mitchell's Psychoanalysis and Feminism of 1974 was decisive, and indeed it's where my own engagement with psychoanalytic feminism began. Sexual difference was the link between the two, targeted not only as the foundation for the sexual, social oppression of women, but also insofar as it is meant to get a grip, once and for all, on the endless vicissitudes of psychoanalysis, of psychosexual life. You become a man and a woman, done, dusted, sorted forever, right? Not a shift, not a dream, not a thought. With startling foresight for debates which will erupt in our time, the first shibboleth to crumble at this theoretical and political turn, Hall noted, would be the seamless category of woman, to which I will return in a minute. From that opening scene in Bayswater, the border has been my theme. So let me use the final part of this lecture to return to the question of borders, external and internal, whose complex relation I hope to have convinced you is a driving principle of Stuart Hall's thought. I'm sure I'm not the only person who, as often as the crises of the time unfold, found themselves thinking, if only we could hear what he has to say. If I now turn to migration and sexual differences, because in both cases, as I see it, mobility is being confronted by dogma in new and deeply troubling ways. We are living in a moment when, to use his own words, a disturbing truth which seems to rise at the margins of society somehow floods the mainstream, changing all perception as it goes. While I've been preparing this talk, the first of these, borders between peoples across land and sea, has daily pressed on public attention as a floundering UK government and other European nation states attempt to retrieve credibility and electoral value by turning the screws. People on immigration bail in the UK are to be tracked via fingerprint scanners, criminalizing the whole bunch. Unsurprisingly, activists have noted, though in fact this clearly has not played the slightest part in government deliberations, such a move will be disastrous for those who have experienced torture or trafficking. On the Greek island of Lesbos, 24 NGO volunteers have gone on trial for assisting migrants fleeing the civil war in Syria in 2015 and 16. Another criminalization, this time the criminalization of solidarity, which is part of an assault on rescue missions across Europe. Along the borders of Hungary, Croatia, and Romania, defiance of EU law and UN conventions means that migrants are being left to freeze in a no-man's land. All of this, of course, about to be already massively aggravated by the earthquake in Turkey and Syria. All attempts to create a refugee sharing mechanism across the European member states have failed. In the UK, the government repeats its mantra that illegal migrants in small boats will be stopped by any means possible from landing on British shores. When it is pointed out to them that there is no such thing as an illegal migrant under international law, they are redescribed as irregular migrants, so that what a regular migrant would look like, I really have no idea. This is the border that hardens at the first hint of social anxiety, when those struggling to cross it find themselves scapegoated for disruption inside the nation, a disruption caused, as it is today, by injustice and inequality, which refuses to redress, or even in many cases, even to name itself. Already in 1992, Hall was witness to what he described as, quote, one of the largest forced and unforced migrations of recent times, when those, quote, displaced by the destruction of indigenous economies, the pricing out of crops, and the crippling weight of debt, as well as poverty, drought, and warfare, buy a one-way ticket and head across borders to a new life in the West, he could again be talking today. 10 years later, in 2002, he returned to the question as, quote, tens of thousands who can no longer survive at the margins of the system are loosed from their moorings and sent drifting across the world. They are caught in what he described as the double helix, the collapse and entrenchment of modern nation states. Migration, he wrote, is, quotes, the dark side, or one of the dark sides, the unacknowledged underbelly of globalization, where everything moves, capital, goods, elites, images, currencies, and only people and labor are meant to stay put. Migration then becomes targeted as responsible for the fact, quote, that unfortunately, things don't seem to stand still and be recognizable anymore, as if they ever did. The 21st challenge posed by global migration will not be met, The Guardian wrote in its leading article of January the 14th this year, by brutally battening down the hatches, which does not mean, of course, that many of the nations of Europe will not continue to try. Migration remains the vote winner, in the words of Lars Darrelson, Swedish ambassador to the EU, the issue on which you can win or lose elections in virtually every single member state. Danielsson is a member of the Swedish Democrats, previously isolated as a racist, anti-immigration, far-right party, which has now entered the heart of government after the Swedish elections last year. Quote from Hall, could Europe be a home for some of the homeless and helpless? Once again, with uncanny prescience and somewhat daunting if fleeting optimism 20 years ago, could Europe be a refuge for some of the homeless and hopeless? Or, he continued, quote, as it lowers its frontiers within, is it proving only too effective at raising them fortress-like to face the new struggling armies of the night? He was referring to the thousands who have been nightly hurling themselves at passing Eurostar trains at the mouth of the Channel. Faced with which that image of migrants from the Caribbean pouring out of Paddington Station in 1951 starts to feel like a lost dream. Illegal or irregular economic migrants or refugees, Black or European, meaning Syrians and Ethiopians and Yemenis, pushed back at the border versus blonde, blue-eyed Ukrainians who have been welcomed with open arms. We are witnessing a politics of definition, where life and death decisions are made on the basis of a single word, and where the state claims a monopoly of meaning, telling people mostly desperate for their lives not only where they are from, but also who and what on earth they might be. Clinching the definitions feels like both a means to an end, reducing the numbers, and an end in itself, a vocabulary of unfreedom in a foreign tongue. I would call this the curse of naming, what Hall, as we have seen, termed the syntax or grammar of politics. And in Familiar Stranger, he calls up that famous moment by Frantz Fanon, when as a young child walking the streets with his mother, another child, white, calls out, "Look, mother, a Negro." The word was enough, a word from which Fanon will never escape. Language must be arrested if we are to hold on to a racially discriminatory world. And as Hall points out, the encounter that Fanon is describing took place at the time of Windrush. It then follows that the more the category of race is exposed as an empty category, as lacking in scientific credibility, the more it will be evoked in the vain, the more vehemently it is invoked, in the vain hope, he writes, that it will bring the argument to a close. Like sexual difference, race as a category makes its fraudulent appeal to autonomy or physiology to wind up the question. The profundity of the depth that lies behind the making of that distinction, he comments, is what we need to begin to learn about the languages of race which we speak. So he's plumbing the depths once more. One thing is clear. Invoking either race or sexual difference as physiological or moral absolutes, often both together, is to his mind simply a way of bringing all discussion, including the need to acknowledge that mostly in politics we are wrong, to a complete standstill. So to the end then with the other border, the border of sexual difference, which is at the forefront of the so-called cultural wars today, provoking unprecedented vitriol, ways of arguing so toxic that it is indeed effectively shutting down all debate. No seamless category of woman, Hall had insisted in 1996. The category of woman, by the way, of course, having been one of the main targets of feminism forevermore. If there is one thing that trans experience has brought irreversibly to the surface, it is surely that the argument about what constitutes sexual difference, like the internal process of uncovering your sexuality, never stops. Although you would be forgiven for thinking otherwise when politicians refuse trans people the right to self-define their genders on the grounds, I am quoting a Scottish MP, that you cannot change your sex. This issue may be enough to lead to the separation of Scotland from the rest of the UK. I mean, the political stakes could not be higher, with the government intervening to stop the law. Or when trans women are excluded from women-only spaces on the grounds that they are in fact still men and therefore intent on abuse. All men are violent, especially, so this argument runs, men who become women, that is, people for whom being a man is exactly what they have chosen not to be. As with the refugees redefined as irregular or illegal migrants, wiping their history off the page, it is the vocative voice, I will tell you who you are, that is for me the crime. Surely at odds with any politics being fought in the name of freedom. You are a man, though you claim to be a woman. And precisely because you lay claim to such a transformation, you are the most dangerous man there can be. I wonder whether anybody else agrees with me that the two halves of this argument slightly cancel each other out. In total disregard of the psychoanalytic insight that we all start with a polymorphous bisexuality and a diffuse eroticism, which at great cost has to be crunched into shape, men and women are, in this argument, distinct forever. Everyone must stay in their primary and allotted place. The echoes of the fears directed at migrants who threaten the world's illusory safety by refusing to stand still are surely unmistakable. So let us compare that way of thinking with Hall's appeal, which I have tried to show runs right through his writing, for a more flexible, unsettled, and changeable, plural, multiple, composite, overdetermined, ruptural way of thinking and a more transformable world. This is from Hall. Because it is relational and not essential, meaning can never be fixed, but is subject to the constant process of redefinition and appropriation, to the losing of old meanings and appropriation and collection and contracting of new ones, to the endless process of being constantly re-signified, made to mean something different in different cultures, in different historical formations, at different moments in time. Or, in the words of a friend in New York who has recently transitioned from female to male, I'm just so happy to be able to live another life in this life we are living. I don't think you can get more open-ended than that. Another life in this world, or another life in this life or world we are living must surely today be what we are all aiming for. To end with these lines from Stuart Hall, quote, once you are plunged into the end of biological definition, you are plunged headlong into the only world we have, the maelstrom of a contingent, unguaranteed political argument, debate, and practice. Hopefully, he states, the outcome would be a critical politics, which is always a politics of criticism. Critical politics, politics of criticism. I like to think that these words might capture something of the ongoing project and never more urgently needed life's work of Stuart Hall. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. Thank you. We'll now stop for a short intermission, about 20 minutes. So please feel free to grab a coffee from the cafe, go to Lou, do whatever you need to do, and we'll see you back here in 20 minutes for the conversation between Sharon and Jacqueline. Thank you. We'll now start the conversation between Sharon Numa and Jacqueline Rose. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you. Oh dear, this is all get caught up in my clothes. Jacqueline, it was a wonderful paper, very wide-ranging and interesting, as I'm sure the whole audience appreciated. And I can only really do a very little bit, address a few of the things that you've said, and hope that we'll have, between us something to say. A lot of it will be about the central role of anxiety, both in individual and public life, but mainly from my perspective, the psychoanalytic clinical role. But a very good example about anxiety is that I left home without the paper, without my notes, and without anything at all. So all those carefully made notes in the last week have totally vanished from my mind. Nevertheless, there are two ways, I guess, to cope with anxiety from infancy onwards: evasion or modification. So I managed to turn up anyway, so we'll try to modify. So there were many things in your paper. There was transgenerational hauntings. There was the business of how the right wing, which is so interesting, managed to mobilize unconscious forces so successfully. And it left me thinking, well, what is it that they mobilize and that gets people so scared that they start splitting and dividing in the ways that they do? So I want to say a little bit, there's also many other themes which have to do with fear. But I want to say a bit about how I would think about this question about being a subject and the development of identity from Melanie Klein's point of view. So I'm not really representing all of psychoanalysis by any means, very much within the British object relations tradition. And I've got to sort of I'm assuming that there's not an audience full of analysts, so I'm going to lay out a little bit how she sees the development of a person, of a personality, and then try to make some links to the issues that Jacqueline has talked about, or she may make those. If time, I'd like to also talk a bit about mourning, which is very much part of, I think, implicit in your paper. So, Klein's, well, of course, Freud made us more aware of the unconscious forces at play beneath our sophisticated levels of operation. On the one hand, he emphasized the instinct of aggression, and on the other, of sexuality. And it's very interesting to see how those get played out in the racial projections that go on, those very fundamental, powerful drives. Klein, I think, added to that in a really important way that's very helpful for this topic, which is her stress on unconscious fantasy. And her view was that all mental, I think I'm right in saying, all mental acts, all mental life is accompanied by fantasy, and they all have an object. Now that then allows us to see how social behavior is informed not just by rational thinking, but by unconscious fantasy. And I think it's those fantasies that influence, support, maintain racist organizations, which I think in analytic terms would count as a kind of pathological organization. So let me just say a little bit about that early development, because it's kind of the groundwork for the mechanisms that I think keep racist organizations going, and I'm sure a lot of you will have given it a lot of thought. She sees the infant's first object is the most important foundational moment relationship, and that is, generally speaking, the mother. And between the infant and the mother, that is also the first encounter with the world. So one could say that the infant also encounters the mother's internal objects, which would have something to do with the question of transgenerational haunting. I think in psychoanalysis it began with thinking about, dead babies, and which hadn't been properly mourned inside the mother, who then comes to her new infant with something inside that is unconsciously communicated. And it would be, I would say, the same for slavery, for the Holocaust, for all the kind of history that comes with a person as they approach their child. The question is how much the mother can be, how much she's processed, and how much she can allow the child to be free of some of the hauntings of the past. But anyway, in that first encounter, Klein describes a sort of important to and fro between mother and baby, where there are fundamentally two types of experience for the infant, good ones and bad ones. Good ones being the satisfaction of need, of hunger, feeling warm, feeling held, feeling attended to. And that registers as a good internal experience. Then there are experiences of frustration, perhaps hunger or delay, where they may feel that there is a bad, hostile experience coming from outside. And to preserve the good internal mother that's being built up, they have to keep the sense of something bad and malignant split off from the good. So this act of splitting is quite important in Klein's view in the early stages of development, because it keeps the good mother safe and available. But over time, the idea is that radical split, where the bad is projected out into the maternal object first, and the good kept within, that is modified over time, and they come to see that the person they love is also the person they hate, and the splitting is diminished, and they can begin to move on to feelings of concern for the damage that's been done in fantasy, in states of hatred. That's a terribly schematic outline of my thoughts, and there are people here who could do it more justice, I think. But I think it sort of sets the scene for mechanisms, the psychic mechanisms of projection, introjection, and also the capacity to identify with a good internal object. Because identification is terribly important through all of this. And one of the things that is very noticeable, and it's very noticeable in current times, is the efforts that those in whose interest it is to break the link of identification with people who are poor, people who are migrants, people who are refugees, that there's a lot going on which aims to kind of shatter the link between people so that they might identify with others. And that, of course, destroys empathy. And, of course, one of the reasons for that is to maintain the status quo and to keep the hierarchies of power in place and so on. So when I think about a racist organization, by which I mean the social organization that's in place, which is inescapable, is that it's maintained by the same sorts of mechanisms of splitting and projection and projective identification. Projective identification was a term Melanie Klein introduced to describe how when not just an impulse, but a part of the self that feels hated, unwanted, in some way destructive, frightening, this was projected into the other, who then is seen as having that quality. So classically, you know, the white person projects into the black person all sorts of hated things that they do not wish to own themselves. And a lot of that will have to do with aggression and sexuality, as I mentioned earlier. And the danger is, of course, for the black person, is that you begin to internalize, as I say, the infant internalizes a good object or a bad object, depending on experience, that you can begin to internalize and identify with that, with what is projected. It's what Fanon called the epidermalization of inferiority. And I think that these psychic mechanisms, splitting and projection, projective identification, are very helpful in thinking about it both from the point of view of the perpetrator, who is projecting things into whether it's refugees or whatever, but also the victim, who can be so affected by it. It's not, of course they're affected, they need not identify with it, but they may. And then they may become the so-called, you know, angry black man, or the whatever it is that's the stereotype might be. Before I say any more, I want to take a pause and see what you think, Jacqueline.
Okay. Well, I'm so glad you're here, Sharon, because I knew you would bring this clinically informed response to the paper, and in a sense call it to account, not in a difficult way, but in a serious way, in terms of what is the deployment of psychoanalysis inside the political argument. And that's an argument that I think Stuart Hall was having with himself for a very long time and was never resolved. And I suppose, I mean, the things you say that really resonate with me are the sort of, the refusal to grieve, I think, is a constant here. The refusal to grieve for violent histories which are still persisting. And I think the beginning of Familiar Stranger, in the discussion of his mother's wish to climb up the social hierarchy and identify with the colonials and see herself as lighter in skin and all of that, was an attempt to identify with certain forms of given power, but also to repudiate the violence that had been done to her own people. I mean, there are other people who may want to take issue with this. So it really was a question of distributing guilt, distributing grief, distributing forms of mourning, which are both possible and impossible. And when you were speaking, I was thinking of a book that I think quite a few people might know of. It's the Michelich's book on the inability to mourn, which is an amazing book about Germany's refusal to acknowledge its history, although in fact Germany has been a darn sight better in acknowledging the Holocaust and its history than a lot of other countries have been in relationship to their own violent histories. So I suppose if we're thinking about the way Stuart Hall analyzes the ability of the right to tap into those mechanisms that you're describing, almost as if they're amateur shrinks.
God,
right?
it's so intuitive.
As if they're intuitive shrinks who know that the best thing to do is to project onto the racial other. And this is the political move then that has to be made. Project onto the racial other whatever it is in the culture that cannot be processed. So I just want to refer here to a wonderful article by the philosopher Howard Kagel in his book, Force and Understanding, which is about the way in which the nation state in modernity has traditionally sent out to the border all the social problems to do with their state management of violence inside the city. And as a way of denying that, they project violence onto the other, who then becomes a threat.
Yes.
And Stuart Hall was brilliant on this in the category of the mugger, right? Which he, when he was analyzing the coercions of a conservative constraint, he was talking about how a certain figure becomes the object of a hatred in order to make all the other injustices in the culture invisible, right? Because that person becomes responsible. So when you were talking just now, I thought you were saying that really, and you may disagree with me about this, what's at stake here is the distribution of internal violence. So it was very important for me that Stuart Hall said, almost in an aside at the end of one of his papers, what psychoanalysis shows is there is violence and aggression in all of us. Or in his engagement with Homi Bhabha, where he talks about the uncertain dark, which is true of everybody at the level of the unconscious. And the question is how you can hold that and not project it in some way. I suppose the question I would have is that in the consulting room, I assume because you're a Kleinian, and because I've read some things by you, I've read an amazing case story by you, for example, where the purpose is, good question. The purpose is, I think as you just described it, to get the hatred of the bad object and the love of the good object to sort of recognize like a kaleidoscope, or like those eye tests I used to have as a child where you had to get the bird in the cage to see whether the focus was working. You know, and of course you never could, right? Because there was always something wrong with your eyes. But basically to try and get two things that really didn't want to be in the same room as each other into the same room. And for Klein, this is where I start to get a bit uncomfortable, because it seems to me as if then Klein calls up the concept of reparation, which I always felt came partly in response to her daughter's hostility to her, because she used her daughter as a patient, and her daughter became a social psychoanalyst. I mean, they had a terrible, terrible rupture. And it always seems to me a little bit like be nice to mummy, right? Which is to say, just re-internalize all that aggression, and then it'll all just be absolutely fine. So, and also, as other people have pointed out, the concept of reparations comes straight out of the First World War. Yes. I say that Klein is formulating it on the back of the Versailles Treaty, where it was extremely dangerous and can be seen as responsible for the second. So I suppose I'm slightly less sanguine than you are about this trajectory of resolution that you're describing, at the same time as I really recognize in what you're saying the mechanisms through which Stuart Hall analyzed the distribution of hatreds and hostility unconsciously as a key component of the politics we're living. And that's why I ended with the question of migration and the question of trans experience, because it seems to me there are two places in which that balance is so finely poised, and life and death decisions are sort of depending on it. I mean, I think I was saying to you a bit earlier that when I read, Sharon has just edited this book out of John Steiner's workshop on questions of identity, and I read a few of the pieces that you kindly sent me. And I was starting to get a little bit uncomfortable about the way he talked about strengthening the ego, and he talked about, you know, reparation and not cure, but sort of, there was a whole vocabulary of identity and ego, which we could talk about a bit more, that made me a little bit uncomfortable, because Lacanianism is a critique of that, right? I mean, it couldn't be in a different position, couldn't be in a more different position. But then he started talking about mourning, and he started talking about irony, and he started talking about things which suggested that even if you move towards these less splitting forms of social identification, it's not the end of the line. It's not definitive, it's not fixed. Because what Stuart Hall, I see him as arguing for, which is why I entered the paper as I did, is more mobility and flexibility of identifications. So it's not identity, it's identification. He really makes that distinction. Because identifications can be layered, whereas identity is, this is me. And when I was thinking about this earlier today, I came across this quote from Freud's Moser monotheism, where he talks about the important discrepancy, see if I can get this right, between our attitude towards the organ of thought and the social arrangements of the world which our thought is meant to be able to grasp. And that idea of discrepancy is that there is something in the world which we cannot master, and attempts to master it are evasive, controlling. So this is a version of the ego as its own worst enemy. It's the ego that believes it can where it was, their ego shall be. It believes that the ego can come in and take control and everything will fall back into place. And that always makes me feel uncomfortable, which may say more about me than it does about anything else.
Well, I think that sort of loops back to your earlier comment about, the treatment of migrants and so on, because it is an attempt to cope with social anxiety, whether caused by migration. It's like Bowman's The Stranger. There's a stranger, and all can be projected onto that, all the dislocation and disorientation by, let's say, mass migration. And then whoever it is, whatever selected group is targeted to hold all that cannot be held within, as it were, the social ego, if you like, is put into a particular group, and then they are placed outside of outside of the human and outside of everyday life and into exclusion zone and across the border. So there's a kind of way in which the splitting is reinstated all the time. And as for the bit about the completeness of identity, I don't think that's what John Steiner believes, or indeed what Klein would say, because I think the integration that I was talking about comes under pressure all the time, and in states of anxiety in particular. I think there is a natural movement towards synthesis as you develop, but it's constantly under pressure, so things are always breaking up a bit. You return to this slightly what she called the paranoid schizoid frame of mind. It's always available, and all of these things which are attached to it, like cruelty and sadism and persecutory fears, are one step away from us. It's not over there in some other kind of peoples, but very much part of all our unconscious life. So I don't think it's a kind of foreclosed situation. I know Stuart Hall's idea was very much one is forever becoming, and I think that's not incompatible with it, but I think we do have an idea of greater or lesser integration, so that there is some state in which you can feel much more able to care about things, by which I mean, with Klein, she described the state of mind that you move towards as you get more integrated, as you recognize the hateful and the loving coming together, which she called the sort of depressive position, which is really about being able to recognize harm done, damage done to those you care about, and wish to make, and feel guilt, and feel sorrow, and feel regret about it, and begin to wish to make reparation. I don't think reparation either is a kind of one-off thing. Okay, I've done that now, everything's fine. But it is a spur, and for her, I think that was also a moral position, that social life is best conducted when it's not motivated by thou shalt not or thou should, but by compassion, care, concern, pity, that whole range of feeling which is strikingly absent in current times. So that would be the more move towards the depressive, but it's not that anything is ever complete. It moves back and forth between these states. And when society is in upheaval, there's much more pressure, I think, socially to return, or rather to shift. It's not a return even, but to shift into those very fragmented, persecuted states of mind. But I thought actually, as you were speaking, that I would tell you about a dream. I can't tell you about the patient, but I can tell you about a dream he had, which just reminded me of how clinically you have to be aware of both these sides. I was leaving for a holiday break, and the patient was not in a good state, so I knew he would feel it. But his tendency was to do something she talks about a lot, which I want to talk about in connection with British exceptionalism, but anyway, which is idealization. And so his attitude to me tended to be rather idealized at this phase, so he didn't show how distressed he was by, and how angry he was by the fact that I was going to be going on a summer holiday. But he brought this dream. He was a Sikh man, and he had a dream of the Golden Temple. And it was very beautiful, and he was there taking his wife by the hand and going into the water around the temple. And it had this wonderful romantic feeling about it. And that was the dream which he brought. And I thought, well, on the one hand, you've got the love of this breast mother, this golden temple, and taking his wife or me in the transference with him, although I don't know about the water, perhaps that was something more tearful. But I also thought, well, the Golden Temple is about Amritsar, apart from anything else, and the absolute brutality and savagery of the massacre that took place there. Mm-hmm. And it was also about the independence issue. So at least I could say to him that, you do have these loving but rather idealized feelings of wanting to be one. But here is Amritsar, and you're full of murderous hatred towards me and would like to sort of kill me off. And maybe you feel I'm murdering you by going away, but there's a massacre going on. And his great concern about dependency as well, because it's a fight for independence. So there were a lot of layers of it, but what's important, I thought, clinically, was to show him both that I appreciated his attachment, but I was well aware and could bear the massacre that I knew was going on. It's taken me a little way away from
that's extraordinary.
From what you were
that's
saying.
An extraordinary story, because I was finding myself thinking, there's always a massacre going on. And that could be a psychoanalytic statement, but it could also be a political statement to do with slavery and colonization and apartheid and World War II.
Yes.
So then one of the questions comes, what do you do with this persistence and distribution of what some people would say is an unpayable debt?
Yeah.
So I'm interested in your concept of reparation, but there's also a kind of insistence on the horror of something that's happened and that passes only partially spoken down through the unconscious, through the generations. And then there has to be an acknowledgement not of reparation, although reparation would help, right, in terms of compensation, acknowledgement, and historical remembrance, but would be something where you have to live with the fact that you've recognized something awful and it can't simply be repaired.
Yes.
Which then leads you to questions of justice and injustice. And I think Stuart Hall, his critique of racism, his desire for the argument to stay open, for the rejection of the epidermalization of the black man and all of that, was, we have to remember, in the name of justice. So the question would be how you get from reparation to social justice. One thing I was thinking of was we've just lived through COVID-19. It's not over. We've lived through it. And there were moments at the beginning, I think, of the pandemic when people thought this was going to be a new form of social solidarity across nations, across class, across race, and so on. And I think one of the most upsetting things that we've witnessed in the last few years, which is at the heart of the very optimistically titled new book that I have coming out, thank you, Becky, for that introduction, is that belief in those forms of solidarity often has had to collapse, as like the vaccinations and the refusal of Britain to lift the restriction on pharmacies patenting their own vaccinations, right? They became quite the opposite of solidarity. There became a redistribution of capital and ownership and possession and mastery and so on. So I suppose what I want to say is that that was a case where the idea of a move towards a general solidarity was, there was a flash of a moment, and there were amazing acts of kindness, and there were forms of social solidarity. but the general belief that this could be a new world order has been stymied by people's defensiveness and obstructiveness and fear, right? So I suppose what we're dealing with all the time, and I think this is why culture was so important for him, because in the cultural forms, and we're about to see another one, you could both register the horror, but through the cultural work itself, you were transforming it. And that's why I think it was so important to him as a site of experimentation and renewal, and also historical recognition and grief, right? And you could hold those things in the same space in some way. I think there is an issue here which is, I don't know quite how to, I don't think I can resolve it, nor could one, but it really is a disagreement, not necessarily between us, but it's a disagreement. Because for Lacan, the idea of any kind of coherent identity that could, the problem was the ego's delusional mastery of the world. And that also seems to me something that COVID has sparked to infinity, not just in the obscene profits of the super rich, as if in the face of death they must accumulate more and more, but also Musk going off into space, right? And there's another multimillionaire who's pouring billions into a lab in San Francisco in order to provide the elixir of life and to make death a scarce and now forgotten memory of what... I mean, it doesn't bear thinking about, really. But these are people who have an awful lot of money. And it's so clear that what COVID has done, because the frailty and the mortality of everybody has been made so visible, is to ratchet up their control of the means of survival and the outlawing of death. So another way of thinking about what needs to be acknowledged is the vulnerability of everybody to mortality and the precariousness of the life we're all living, and the defenses that people mobilize against that. So I'm really just twittering on a little bit here, but I think what we're struggling towards is a form of recognition of psychic complexity that can be seen in the ways it feeds into what can be called paranoid, splitting, racist, and misogynist violence, which we must bring in here because that is to do with violence against women, which has to be talked around in terms of the question and reality of sexual difference. So we're talking about the divisions of the culture which harden and then increase the violent quotient, which they are the heirs of. And I think your move towards reparation is one way of solving the problem, not solving it completely, as you said, but when you talk about more flexible identities, you say because the anxiety returns. Whereas I think Stuart Hall would want to add more of a positive quotient to identities that aren't secure. I think he'd see that as a more flexible and open way of living. So I think that's the difference between us. I don't know, how are we doing for time? I think
they're flagging us up frantically.
I think we're floundering a bit here.
They're flagging us frantically. But can I have just to say one thing, which is about the issue of reparation, which I must say I find myself feeling very pessimistic about it at a social level, because it would require, by reparation, I mean just trying to make amends, and it requires a great deal of acknowledgement of harm done, which perhaps is something that Klein added to Freud's mourning for the lost object. She said you also mourn the damaged object. But if they cannot recognize the damage, and it seems to be something that's incredibly difficult, they're always falling back on the idealization of self and of...
And projecting the damage onto somebody else.
The damage elsewhere.
Then you can kill.
Yes,
because they're the villain.
Exactly. And that's very much the sort of on the basis of the whole slavery and colonialism thing. So I don't feel particularly optimistic about the social capacity for reparation at the moment. But anyway.
No, well, I know what you mean. I mean,
I'm so sorry. It's always so difficult to interrupt. And such a lovely conversation. It's always so hard. Thank you, everyone. It's always, I'm just going to sit down. We're about to move to the audience Q&A. So we can definitely continue this conversation and touch on some of the nodes that were already discussed. So we're going to open it up to the audience now. So if you do have any questions, please raise your hands and jump in. We'll be on the lookout. We have one question here.
There's one over there.
We have another question over there in the middle.
And a gentleman there at the front.
And
Mike Roston.
Could you keep your hand up until the mic reaches you, if that's okay? Who had the hand up in the middle? Oh, here. Thanks, Elsa.
So my question is, could we understand the move to solidarity as an analogous to the move to reparation, something that will never be completed, is fundamentally ironic and fundamentally involves kind of mourning? Is there because I think is it interesting to understand the move to solidarity as something also that is impossible to complete and maybe worth kind of problematizing and holding in a degree of irony? Yeah.
I'll say something quickly, shall I?
Or should we take a few questions and then answer them?
We can do that. Should we take all three questions and then answer? And the second question from the middle.
So is this on? Yeah. So my question is also about reparation. Yeah, it seems to me that if it's important to hold on to this idea that, as Stuart Hall points to, that we all have aggression or a capacity for aggression within us, then the idea of repair and the awareness of the harm we cause to others seem very associated. But your assertion that Klein's development of the idea of reparation has to do with the hostility that she had with her daughter, and also the Versailles example. I wondered if you could say more about both of those, because and the actual link that you were making in both of those.
I didn't hear the last part of that question.
Could you repeat the last part?
Okay, so I think you said in terms of the development of Klein's idea of reparation, that you were linking it to hostility with her daughter, and also the example of post-World War I and the Versailles Treaty. And I was wondering if you could say a bit more about both of those links.
What was the second one? One was
Versailles.
about the daughter.
The Versailles Treaty.
The Versailles Treaty. Oh, right, okay.
I think you said it was to do with both the Versailles Treaty and the hostility with her daughter. So to say more about those.
Thank you.
And also if Sharon has a response to that would be great.
Mike Rustin wants to ask a question. You might have some. Oh, no.
Oh, so we had a... Michael? Yes. Oh.
Because he'll have something to say about reparation.
Well, I want to ask a question that I think relates to what both the speakers have said in their terrific talks, which is, Jacqueline talked about the number and range of right-wing reactionary movements and governmental forces that have been going around recently, Trump, Bolsonaro, in Sweden even, obviously Thatcher and post-Thatcher, all the things that are going on in Britain, and even Putin, we could say, too. Sharon has been talking about anxiety. And my question is, what is it that makes all these right-wing frenetic forces so anxious? What are they anxious about? What is the alternative future that they see they're facing that threatens them, that threatens the society that they sort of control, if they don't smash it, if they don't suppress it? Mustn't there be something that is real as a potential, as a possibility of what a different society might be in terms of justice, equality, thinking, learning, education, whatever, that petrifies these people so much that their whole political mission is to destroy and smash all this? Now, the second thing one has to say is that people who think that there might be such an alternative set of possibilities, as Stuart obviously did, aren't making a very good job of articulating what that should be. And it is rather paradoxical that the evidence that there is such a possibility mainly lies in the ferocity of those forces that are actually committed to trying to destroy and prevent it from coming into existence. I think Stuart's project was always to try to bring it into existence, but whether that project can be continued is obviously quite a worry.
Do you want to respond?
I'll say something first, and I think you'll have... when you were talking about what is it they fear, what came to my mind was Alan Taylor, I think, wrote a book called The Internal Enemy, and which I haven't read properly, but I remember something about it. And he quotes Thomas Jefferson saying that slavery is like holding a wolf by the ear. You cannot safely let him go, nor can you hold him. And I suppose when I think of what interferes with reparation, so it's partly speaking to the earlier question, is fear of retribution and the reversal of the power, the hierarchy of power, that there will be a sort of retributive justice. And if you let people develop and share in the common wealth, then they will turn the tables and you will lose all the power and privilege that you have. So that was partly what occurred to me about that. And that also gets in the way of any kind of reparation because fear needs to keep things where they are. And that's kind of a bit linked to the question about solidarity, I thought. You know, when I was thinking about anxiety, I thought what helps with the individual is containment, so that sadism and cruelty and so on can be modified. But what helps, where does that come from at a social level? That's a puzzle to me. Who is going to contain the human aggression in society? Is that good governance, or is it community solidarity, or what? I have no answers, but it just made me think about, what you asked made me think about whether community performs a sort of containing function which might move towards change, but it hasn't happened. It keeps getting smashed, so I'm not sure that it's a real
Yeah, we
option.
agree with that. And I was thinking of the psychoanalyst Leon, who wrote about group psychology and was so clear about the work group, which is the group's project in common, and the basic assumption group, which is the phantasmagoria, which drives groups at a fundamental unconscious level, like flight, fight, pairing, leader, messianism. And it's so clear in his article, which is a review of Freud on the group, that the struggle between the basic assumption group and the work group is not won by the work group. There is no group without the basic assumption group. And just to put it more simply, groups collectivize themselves on condition of expelling hatred to the margins of the group. Now, in relationship to Mike Rustin's question about what is causing the anxiety, I think it's historical memory that's being denied about the constitution of nations through acts of violence. As Ernest Renan says in his famous essay, What is a Nation? Nations are united by their forms of forgetting, and they're united by the phantasmatic histories they create in order to suppress the violence that was at the origin of their constitution as a nation. I think, so first of all, I'd say it's forgetting, and secondly, it's loss. You answered your own question. The anxiety is produced by the fear of loss of power because they know they are not entitled. Nobody's entitled to power over another person in that form. And that's what I think, that's why they're right to be frightened. They're right to be anxious. In relationship to Putin, I've read so much now which says he believes in Greater Russia.
Yes.
And it's a divine ordinance. And it's the point at which the nation state mystifies itself into a kind of messianic truth. And we are still the children of the birth of the nation state. And I think one of the most depressing, this fits in with what you're saying, Mike, one of the most depressing things we've seen in the last however many years is that what looked like a critique of ethno-religious nationalism in favor of broader forms of global communication and participation has failed. And we're seeing the resurgence. Well, Stuart Hall called it the double helix of the collapse of the nation state and the re-entrenchment of the nation state. And I think if you're interested in the question of how violence gets expelled and then comes home to roost psychically, you have to start with nationhood. That would be my response to that. In relationship, I realized when I threw out the question of Melissa Schmideberg and I threw out the question of World War I and reparations, in relationship to the second, I was simply saying that Klein did not choose an innocent concept. So to talk about reparation as the end point of a successful analysis, whilst I recognize everything Sharon has described in terms of the need to re-internalize forms of aggression and violence, which we're talking about, I think there's something just worth thinking about, that reparation at exactly that moment of time, or actually a while before, roughly the time she's theorizing reparation, had proved itself to be a catastrophe in terms of what it did to Germany after the First World War, leading for some people to the Second. So we need to be wary of the concept. And the other thing is just from years ago when I read Melissa Schmidberg, and she was her mother's patient, and she ended up in an analysis with Glover, who had fallen out with her. I mean, it's a real, it's like EastEnders. It's a real family saga in psychoanalytic technicolor. And basically, her daughter was saying, this is a social phenomenon you're describing. What you're calling for, the aggression and the violence, is socially determined. And Melanie Klein was talking about an inner unconscious fantasy world, as you said, Sharon. And in fact, there are several points in my reading of Stuart Hall where he is struggling with how you make that work between psychic and social determinants of our political identities. And he says, of course it's true that there is no political identity without a psychic unconscious undercurrent. On the other hand, he says in one essay, it's really important for him that there's a residue. There is a residue which cannot be reduced to the psychic component of political identity. Otherwise, what is the hope for a politics? You know, in other moments he says it the other way around, which is without an understanding of unconscious determinants, there will be no political intervention or transformation. And he's basically trying to square a circle that can't be squared, which is how you how you chalk up that balance between inner and outer worlds. I don't think anybody has satisfactorily produced an answer to that question.
While you mentioned Bion, I just wanted to add, who is a post-Kleinian writer, the question of knowledge, you know, and denial, and what Freud called negation and so on, that we seem to be very much in a state of what Bion referred to as -K, kind of stripping away of meaning of things rather than getting to know the truth. There's a reverse process, really, of dissembling and lying and all of that, so that how you move to the things that you're talking about without truth, some approximation, and a wish to know about the past and bear the memories and the guilt. It's very difficult to imagine, isn't it?
But I think Lacan, and I would also say Stuart here to some extent, would say that's all very well, indeed, that one has to recall the history that's being denied, but never think you're in possession of the truth, because then you think you can rule the world. And truth is a very, very dangerous category if you think you're in control of it.
So we'll take some questions from online, and also gentleman in the middle here, actually, we'll go with you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk, which has really inspired me to go back to reread Stuart's essays, and your foregrounding of the psychoanalytic idiom and conceptual substratum in so much of the writing really was very helpful and very striking. Thinking about the emphasis on instability, psychic instability, what erupts in order to throw the ego or the subject into crisis. It sometimes seems to me that one could almost stand it on its head, because what psychoanalysis seems so very good at demonstrating, in which we encounter in analysis so often, is the opposite of that, is fixity and a form of psychic fixation to which, despite the mobility of symptoms and phenomena, the subject is dragged back again and again to some form of formational fixation, which can be itself profoundly self-destructive, but is also formative at the same time. Psychoanalysis is very good at showing, as it were, what's wrong with the various forms of psychic fixation or fixing or stability. It specializes in that in lots of ways, and the whole model of trauma does that so much. And of course, the formulation you quoted a couple of times of Lacan's, the ego's delusional aspiration to mastery. But it does, how does psychoanalysis, I wonder, help us to think about the psychic processes that might lead to solidarity? That, how we might think of a participatory collective identification? Because when you get a great upsurge of popular movement so often, and I'm thinking in particular, for instance, the failure of the Arab Spring, the wonderful festive political carnival in Tahrir Square in the center of Cairo, and the way that left, what legacies did that leave when the backlash came? Now, traditionally, Marxism had its own answer to that in the Leninist theory of the party, but we know what problems that led to. So I'm wondering how psychoanalysis might help one to think about the psychic formation of collective identities that are enabling and that enable participatory group action in a productive sort of way, rather than that moves beyond the emphasis on psychic fixation and the delusional nature of the ego, etc. Group psychology in the ego doesn't really quite cut it, does it? It throws insights or light on, say, the emergence of Trump or the emergence of similar figures, Orban in Hungary, wherever, Putin perhaps in Russia. But it doesn't help us to think about the positive enabling participatory identifications that might be shared in ways that are not destructive.
Thank you.
Do you want to take some questions online? We've only
Yes,
got about 4 minutes left.
Do we have any questions from our online audience?
Yeah, so this one's from one of our online audience members, and is in the spirit, tangentially related, I would say, to the previous question. And the question is for both speakers, and it's, could you both perhaps speak on the idea of the political unconsciousness being awakened, and how we might move towards encouraging the politically neutral to engage in activist-based practices?
Could you repeat the end of that question? Sorry, Diane.
And how we might move towards encouraging the politically neutral to engage in activist-based practices.
Politically neutral what?
Activist-based practices.
Activist practices. Activist practices.
And are there any, we can take 2 more questions from the audience. One from the front. And we'll also take...
Right at the back there, gentleman at the back.
Oh, right at the back.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay,
yeah, okay.
Now
okay.
there are about 10
sorry,
questions.
So the lights are very bright over here. It's actually quite difficult to make people out. Okay. Yeah, if you go ahead.
Okay. So it's kind of like, it's related, but it's not directly related to everything that's been talked about. But one of my favorite pieces of writing from you, Jacqueline, is your work on Sylvia Plath. And I thought it just kind of, I was reminded of it when you were talking about identification and identity and the limits of that and truth, and the way in which, for example, in The Haunting of Sylvia Plath, you talk about Daddy and Little Fugue, and how Plath really pushes identity as far, or identification as far as it can go, and how problematic that's been viewed as, but also how kind of revolutionary and provoking and interesting. And I just wondered if you could talk to that a little bit, and maybe like metaphor and speech and communication, and how that links in with, just like that.
Thank you. And at the back, do we have the mic for the person at the back? Oh, there's not enough mics. So sorry. How many mics do we have? One more mic floating around.
It's a gentleman right at the back. Yeah.
We have and we have one more question in the middle here. Yeah. Sorry, that's all we have. All we have time for. I'm so sorry. If you go ahead.
Okay. Hello. My question might be a bit random, but I was kind of triggered to think about some research that was done quite a long time ago by, well, back in the day when white people wanted to study really small villages in Africa. And I was reminded about this one particular kind of research that they did on one indigenous village, to where they wanted to see how children would react to them putting a basket of apples under a tree and asking the children to essentially compete with one another and run towards the basket of apples, and whoever would run and get to the basket of apples first would get the whole basket of apples. And what they found, quite interestingly, was that the children, when it was time to start the race, held each other's hands and ran towards the basket. And then they all reached the basket together, and they took the apples out and sat in a circle and ate. And they asked the children, you know, why was it that you did that? And one of the children said that, you know, how can we all be happy if one of us is sad? And the thought, that thought was really triggered by the language that was used around immigration and refugees. And I was kind of wondering whether you could speak to the idea of competition and how the idea of competition that's kind of actually really ingrained within Western society, how that plays a role in policy making and the unconscious.
Thank you. And then we have, if we can get the mic to the middle here. Just here. If you put your hand up, again, that's right. Thanks, Nia.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for Dr. Jacqueline. It was very interesting, and thank you for your contributions, Sharon. So my question also will be about psychoanalysis. So Freud was mentioned a lot, rightly so, founder of psychoanalysis. Klein, founder of British Object Relations. And Lacan was mentioned, Winnicott was mentioned. And Jacqueline, you mentioned about the other. There is also the other of psychoanalysis within it. And one of the main strains, especially recent decades, and also from first time with Ferenczi, and also in the UK by John Bowlby, and recently by Fonagy, Jeremy Holmes, and the US by Stephen Mitchell, the Lewis Aron, the relational psychoanalysis. So not like fantasies, but the real happenings in life, and the attachment theory and so on. So I guess my question is about how do you see Stuart Hall's work from a relational psychoanalysis perspective?
Do we have time to respond?
No,
So, do we have to stop? Can we run over a bit more? We've got 1 minute to answer all these questions.
I think.
Yeah.
I think if there's one of those questions that really stood out to you, please do.
Right, over to you, Jacqueline.
Please do feel free to answer.
Sorry, I'm having a little trouble with my sound system, as you can. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can. Okay, I'll just hold the mic. Whoa. Well, it just covers all the ground, right? So I want to say, in relationship to psychoanalysis' theorizing of empathy, I would want to say, certainly in the Freudian corpus, it remains an open question, as he says, how one conscious, unconscious mind can register fully the existence of another. Let's say he doesn't completely answer the question, I think for good reason. But I remember once interviewing Hannah Siegel a long time ago, and she said, there is a problem, there is no understanding of empathy in Freud's work. I thought that's because he's describing the obstructions and the obstacles and the fixities against empathetic understanding. He's taking that as the starting point. So I don't think it's assumed or explained in any straightforward way. However, if you move to somebody who's turned against psychoanalysis, and some of the students who are here have just read this article by Michael Borg-Jakobsen, The Freudian Subject from Politics to Ethics, where he argues that the computation of I am to identify with the other can take two forms. You are the same as me, colonization, that's killing. You are the same as me. I am the same as you, that's destitution, that's a recognition of your own mortality, that's death. And he's saying that is the only basis for an anti-totalitarian pernicious, murderous form of group formation. It's still, I think, a very powerful article today, but I love the connection to Plath because you reminded me of something for which I thank you, which is that what Plath is doing in Daddy and in Little Fugue is forging an identification with an experience she didn't live. And that has caused outrage. The allusions to the Holocaust in Daddy and in Little Fugue have caused outrage because she wasn't there. Well, hello, the people who were there are no longer alive, or not that many of them are longer alive, and it relies, the transmission of that knowledge, on the capacity to identify across the boundaries of generation. And that's what she's laying claim to in the poem. So I think that would be a beautiful example of the kinds of empathy and connectedness that we're struggling in this room to produce an adequate account of, and not for nothing, I would say. Finally, relational psychoanalysis. Well, I'm not a specialist on that at all. I start reading it and I don't get very far because I think it starts by assuming the thing that needs to be explained. I say it assumes that there is relationality, which then takes a kind of ethical, positive psychological gloss and actually doesn't even get halfway towards Melanie Klein. Although she's seen as the origins of it, I think her analysis of the complexity and pain and anguish of object relations and that trajectory is light years ahead of relationality as I understand it in contemporary psychoanalytic thinking. But that could be my ignorance. Okay, thank you.
I will leave. I think that's a very good note to end on. We're over time.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.